Many thanks for your patience, everybody. We've just had a few glitches at this end. Hopefully it won't be too many more months before sort of Zoom cliches will be a thing of the past. So thanks for joining us this evening. We thought it'd be really useful having sort of spent some time putting together the programme for how grades are going to be awarded this summer, just to hold an information session with you all this evening and give you a chance to ask any questions that you've got. I'm going to pass over to Mr. Gillies very shortly. And what Duncan's going to do is he's going to take us through some of the parameters that were set out by the government. So basically the restrictions that we have to work within as to how we can go about awarding the grades. Then he's going to just take us through the process that we've decided with some explanation as to why we've decided that way. And then if you could use, please, the chat facility to send through questions, whether to the whole group or just on the private version. And then we'll just take any questions and we'll run it through like that. The last thing from me is just to say it's been just brilliant having the boys and girls back in school again. It's made a huge difference to us. I'm sure it's making a big difference to all of you as well. It's gone surprisingly smoothly in the sense that they seem to have sort of found their feet in terms of the usual sort of the rhythm and the pattern of school, which is pretty amazing, having not been here for about 3 months now. And it has been very good. The other thing I wanted to do also was just thank everybody for all your support on getting the testing done before we started coming back into school. That made a gigantic difference to how smoothly we could kick the week off. For your information, for your interest, we've now conducted well over 2,000 separate tests since the pupils came back, and thus far we have had no void tests and we have had no positive tests either, which I think is great news, and hopefully that means we can then just carry on. So anyway, I'm going to pass over to Duncan now, just to talk us through the background to how the grades were going to be awarded and the process that we've been through at this end. So Duncan, on to you.
Okay, so as you know, the government said at the beginning of the year that there would be no formal examinations in the traditional sense this summer. They then decided that the teachers needed to award the grades, or recommend the grades is probably a better way of looking at that. At that point, there's not much guidance as to how that would happen. They did say that they weren't going to use an algorithm, so essentially within certain limitations, the grades which schools put forward would be the final grades which pupils were to get. So they then produced some documentation and some guidance on the timings of this, and also the sort of things which we needed to be sure that we were looking at. So the timing has limited us in what we can do. So the timing is that by the 18th of June, we have to have submitted all of our, I'm going to call them recommended grades, simply because there is a process which goes on after that, which is just to check that we have done things as we ought to have. So that's the 18th of June, and we take 2 weeks before that. We then get to the summer half-term holidays, and if we then work back from that, we have the 6 weeks of the first half of the summer term. And we felt that, given we came back yesterday to school with 3 weeks to go, and with the 6 weeks of the next half term coming up, that was the best time frame in which to work. We do have to be able to evidence the grades which we give. Now, the evidence could come, in theory, from all sorts of things during the 2 terms. However, the government was quite specific and said, you know, you're likely to get the best sense of what people have achieved later on in the course, and they were very encouraging of us to continue teaching as much as possible, but equally to recognise that in each school certain amounts of teaching won't have taken place, and that we mustn't disadvantage our pupils because of what has happened during COVID. But of course, the advantage and disadvantage with different schools and different parts of the country will have been quite different. So what we have had to do is work out a way which we can give a grade which is fair, which is evidenced, which shows what pupils have achieved at this point in the 2-year course. So coming up to the end of the 2-year course. So the structure we put together, we feel does two things. First of all, it means that we can guide and direct pupils in these final assessments, which we'll be doing next term, closely and helpfully. We also have a couple of little safeguards put in there, which will ensure that if, as does happen in normal exam seasons, someone has a bad day, or sometimes someone has several bad days, we can mitigate against that. So we do have to evidence stuff, which is why we couldn't just say, okay, we think so and so is getting should be getting an 8 or a 9 or a 6 or a 7. Certainly, that was some of the impression that we could do that in the way that it was reported in the press. But the government has, I think, quite rightly says, okay, you need to make a judgment, but you need to be able to evidence that judgment. And they've strongly encouraged us to use exam board material, past papers. There will also be exam boards will also be producing some further material for us to use, and the questions should be exam type questions. The papers, however, don't need to look like exam papers. It should be the sort of things individually that would have appeared in the exams, but we can move these things around, both with the content, the dividing up of the course, and we feel that the structure we've put together is going to be helpful for that. We do have to go through I know one of the concerns that people will have is, okay, what is stopping a school from suddenly, putting in everyone for an 8 or a 9? There is a safeguard against that in the way the system is to work, is that the exam boards will do some sampling of schools, so we will presumably be asked in at least some of our subjects to send in the work which we have used to come to our judgments. They'll assess that seems to be, broadly speaking, in line. And also they will have a general look at the performance which we put forward for our school as compared with things in the past. Now, that's not to say that it has to look exactly the same, because each year is a bit different, and particularly in smaller subjects there can be some variety there. But those are the sort of things which are safeguards which are against schools suddenly inflating just for the benefit of their own pupils. They're the sort of parameters we've had to work around, and I think we've come up with something which should work in pupils' favour. It will make sure that they can have a chance to perform well, but also if things don't quite go well in the day, we've got a few mechanisms for looking back and looking at further evidence to make sure that we don't have someone who we would put in a grade which is less than we would have expected, because we've got these measures in place. So I'll just briefly go through how we're going to go about it, which is outlined in the document which I sent home a couple of days ago. Over the course of this next 3 weeks, for those pupils who are in subjects which are still doing some coursework, they'll continue to do that coursework, and that coursework will contribute as a proportion of the final grade we submit. Now, it is not necessary that they finish that coursework. Some people will have finished it because it was done before Christmas. Some people will, because of the nature of the subject, will have not quite finished that. And even within one subject, there may be pupils who have finished, partly finished their coursework, and pupils who have completely finished it. The government has been very specific about not disadvantaging or advantaging people in one or other position. So there will be some coursework. So there will be some things which will contribute to the final grade, which are happening now or have already happened if they're to do with coursework. When we come to next term, the approach we've decided to take is that we'll have a week of normal teaching, and then we'll have a week of assessment where each subject will be assessed in one, in most cases, quite short test, assessment, call it what you will. And the idea being that we can carve up the course such that we can teach the test, if you like, for a week. Then they'll have an assessment, and then when they get to the next week, that part of the course will be completed, and then we can move on to the next one. So there's another week of teaching, and then another week of assessment. So that cycle of teaching, then assessment, will be repeated 3 times, which gets us to the 6 weeks. Now, the assessment themselves, as I mentioned earlier, they will be largely drawn from exam board material. So the questions will be things which are like in papers, but where we can, and it's not always possible in every subject to do this all the time, where we can, we will try to compartmentalise the preparation which is needed for each sort of week's work and week's assessment. Well then, and at the end of that, we will have 3 assessments for each subject. For those that have coursework, we'll also have a coursework mark to go into that, and we shall combine those, and then we will look at the grades which come out of that, and there will be a sort of starting point for the final grade we calculate and then submit to the boards. The check, I talked about the safeguard, if you like, is that we will look back at the predicted grade. Now, we haven't given you the predicted grades yet. We did our own internal predicted grades shortly after the trials, but in 10 days' time, there will be another predicted grade, which will be each teacher's best estimate of what grade ultimately the pupil is likely to get. So that gives a sense of, where in our professional judgment each pupil is likely to be, and we can use that as a test in case someone doesn't do as well as they might. Now, so what that, in terms of how that sort of checking mechanism will work, if we, for instance, think in a subject that someone is going to a 7 is the most likely grade, that'll be the predicted, the indicative predicted grade, which will be for that subject in 2 weeks' time. And if when we do the assessments, we come out and this person gets a 7, then that will be their final grade, based on those 3 weeks of assessment and possibly the coursework. If they get an 8 in those ones, then the 8 will stand. That grade which they did in those assessments, that's the one which will stand. If, however, they get a 6 in that, what we'll go back, well, first of all, we'll go back and check what we've done. We'll look at the 3 different assessments. It might be that there were 3 6s. It might be that there were sort of 2 8s and a 5, for example, and we'll look and say, okay, that looks, 2 8s and a 5 looks more like this person is actually pretty strong, but had 1 very bad day. So we'll go back and look more carefully at that. We might also go back and look at earlier information from the trials from earlier in the year to get a sense of why did we think at one point, this was just before Easter holidays, that a 7 was the most likely, and actually something somewhat different has come up there. So this is our check really to ensure against the phenomenon of well, either the 1 bad day or these things are, these are tough times. Exam seasons are always tough for all pupils, and sometimes things don't go the way they should. So we're trying to mitigate against that variability which comes in normal exam seasons, and also the sense that sometimes it might be fatigue, it might be just the difficulty of what was happening in one particular day or one particular week. So that's going to help us check on that. But so that's our approach. So I'll just try and sort of summarise it sort of briefly and quickly as follows. In the summer term, in the first half of the summer term, a week of teaching and a week of assessment. That process is repeated twice to make a total of 3. We'll then create a mark based on that, which, if coursework is part of the course, will include the coursework. We'll look at that grade. We'll then compare that with the predicted grade. If it is the same or better than the predicted grade, then that is the grade which stands. If it's less than the predicted grade, we'll go and look more carefully. It doesn't mean that we'll necessarily just give you the predicted grade, but we need to look more carefully at why the prediction is different from that, and then we'll make a determination of that. Now, Because of the speed with which we have to get through both the assessment and the teaching, and because we don't know where the grade boundaries and so forth will be, the pupils will not get back their marks for the individual papers they do each week, because we may well not have marked them at that point. What we feel is most important is that we teach during that week so they're prepared for the next assessment. We also, of course, need to do our own internal moderation between different classes, and that will take the first 2 weeks of the next half term. So I think what I'll do is pause there and invite you to throw in questions into the chat facility, and I'll hand over to Mr. Walker to compare that particular things.
Thank you very much. I'll compare. John, I'll come to you in just a moment if I may. I can see your hand up there. So there's a question that's come through already. Just briefly before we go into this. One of the balances that we've had to make has been between trying to avoid a small number of very high stakes tests right at the end of the course. And so we want to be able to look at not avoiding that for the pupils. Likewise, we don't think it's in their interest to be subjecting them to 9 weeks of perpetual testing between now and half term and the summer term as well. And obviously we want to be able to where it's to their benefit, to be able to look at the breadth of the whole course as well. So those have been some of the discussions that we've been having internally with the heads of department. Those have been the sort of the Scylla and the Charybdis, if you like, that we've been trying to steer the boat through to try and get to what we think is pretty much the sweet spot. In doing that, we've also been talking to a ton of other schools which are very similar to St Peter's as well. The Independent School Council published a sort of a suggested indicative way of doing it, which is remarkably close to us. And actually, all schools, while there are some differences that we're aware of, do seem to be settling and coordinating towards this one. There's a question that's come from on the chat function, so I'll just go to that one, which is, it says, when marking the weekly tests, will you award grades based on school averages or national averages?
Okay, it's a really interesting and good question. What we're going to do is sort of what is done in normal exam times, and that is we mark them and give a mark to each paper. Grade boundaries are only calculated after the tests have been done. So when we do add them all up, we'll get a distribution of marks overall, and then we'll work out where to put the grade boundaries. Now, those grade boundaries will initially reflect the fact that this year's GCSE pupils are fairly similar to previous year's GCSE pupils. So I guess the basic answer to the question is we look to get fairly similar school averages for each level as compared with us in the past, as opposed to national averages.
And obviously there's an advantage for Peters here in that we've actually got a long track record of very, very strong examination results. So when we're looking at it and coming out with what we believe to be the right grades for the pupils, if we're asked to justify that by the exam boards, along with all the other evidence and data we'll have, we'll also obviously be able to look back and rely upon that as well. So thank you. There's a question I think I can answer from Dave, which says, are the IGCSE and GCSE grades being determined in exactly the same way? Yes, is a simple, quick answer to that one. So, and again, using very much the same sort of outline that Duncan was explaining just now. Okay, so there's a question about finding out about the predicted grades and asking questions about them. So, Duncan?
Okay, predicted grades will be sent home, I think, on the second last Friday of term, or that Saturday possibly, and that will be ahead of when there will be a parents' evening. Well, it's a parents' couple of evenings, which will be in the last week of term. So you will have predicted grades end of the second on Friday week. And in the final week of term, there will be a parents' evening to discuss, what to do next.
Okay, thank you. And then a question there about how far in advance of the test will pupils get an exam timetable so that they can determine and plan their own revision?
I think the beginning of next week we should have the overall exam timetable for everyone to see. So you'll know what's first up, what's second up, what's third up.
And as well as the timetable, the pupils will also know which bits of content are being taken out of the courses as well. So heading in towards the Easter holiday, they'll be going into that knowing what's the structure of the timetable for the examinations which are coming up, which material they don't need to revise and which material they will need to revise. And then as they're going through those 6 weeks, I think there's a pretty strong advantage for them in that they won't know the questions in advance, but they'll know the topics which are going to be assessed in each of the assessments. And obviously the work being done in class with the teachers can be spent doing sort of consolidating, checking their learning and understanding of that limited amount of material, which they then know what the content is. They then go into the exams. And I think it won't sort of surprise you to know this either. Normally, of course, you have to revise 2 years worth of content. You go into a high stakes environment where potentially 100% of the course could be examined. It won't be 100%, but you don't know which proportion and what's going to come up. And you don't know which questions are going to come up in a fairly sort of obtuse or difficult to understand or ambiguous or abstract sort of way. So not having those sorts of questions in there as well, I think is also going to sort of support the pupils as they go through too. And hopefully, sorry, I've just seen a question that came through. It said, are pupils expected to revise for the assessments during the Easter break? Will they be provided subject areas that will be covered? So I hope that what I've just said will help there. So I'm going to pass to Duncan for this one, which is, will the past papers be used in the assessments?
In all probability, yes. The government or the exam boards are providing us that we haven't seen them yet, but they are going to provide us with sort of banks of questions. I think a lot of those banks of questions will be simply from past papers, and in our the objective is that they should be past paper questions. So in one sense, if you did every past paper question, you probably have done some of the assessments anyway. So the old-fashioned preparation of doing past paper questions is a really good way to revise. However, just remember that the papers themselves won't be as diffuse as that. So the question types, so it's well worth practicing those sorts of question types.
Yeah. Okay, I think this is probably, so my lovely colleague Sarah Opie is helping to pass the questions on. So she's saying, have you covered this one? Are the IGCSE and GCSE grades being examined in exactly the same way? I think we have covered that one, Sarah. Yes, they are going to be covered in the same way.
There's just one slight variation is one of the exam boards does require us to have a slightly longer exam for one of them. So the way we calculate it would be exactly the same, but you might have noticed I said in the document that the tests will be typically of about 1 hour. Where they're longer, that's because one of the exam boards has said it needs to be effectively a past paper, and that might take you up to 1 hour and 15 or 1 hour and a half for one paper only.
And it's worth also just saying at this point that we've actually had quite limited contact from the exam boards in terms of them saying to us, and in some ways it's an advantage and a disadvantage. The advantage obviously is that it gives us more freedom to apply the structures to the way that we think will work best for our pupils. The disadvantage is that obviously it may be that an exam board might get in touch with us in the next couple of weeks and say, actually, we'd like you to do something slightly differently. Obviously, I mean, over the last year, I think it doesn't matter what industry you work in, your willingness to adapt and be flexible and shift as things change is part and parcel. So I hope that's helpful. John, I can see you sort of...
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming. 2 questions which are connected. You talk about your predictive grades. I would like to understand how they have been generated. And 2, if your cohort this year is stronger or weaker than a previous cohort, which clearly as school leaders you will know about, are you using that to affect your grades?
Okay.
It might be an old school teacher question, but I understand about cohorts and I really do understand predictive grades. So I would like a fairly clear answer to what I'm asking.
Sure. I think I'll answer the second question and pass to Duncan for the first one. I mean, Duncan may want to come in on the second question anyway. We're not going to, although there's a truth that this year's cohort is broadly very similar to previous cohorts. We would never start from previous cohorts as a grid and then to say, okay, we're going to squidge that onto the actual boys and girls who are in this particular cohort.
But you've just said you were using previous results to generate it, and that is my concern.
Duncan, do you want to?
Yeah.
So it might be back over to Duncan now.
Yeah, I mean, we have a fair bit of other data, baseline data, which was conducted when the pupils were younger in third form, which suggests that they are broadly speaking very close to that. To other year groups. That doesn't mean that we're going to, if our percentages look 3 or 4 or 5% higher or lower, we're going to automatically fit that bell curve to one thing or the other. In nearly every subject, we've got teachers who have been marking with exam boards, so our understanding of exactly where a level should be is pretty good. But I think, I suppose, the determination of is one cohort the same as the other, it is broadly speaking the same, and we have some data to support that conclusion. That said, we're not going to automatically slide these things around. Now, one of the reasons we're not going to slide them around is because the system we've been asked to put in place, as was the system last year, does take out some of the vagaries of an exam system where a few people drop down a bit lower. So the natural position would be that the results we have this year will be a little bit higher than a normal exam year. And the last normal exam year we had was 2019. I think we're not tied to it, but it is a way that we and the government are using to just look carefully at how we have allocated the grades within it. And I think there's a fair bit of tolerance in there because there is a bit of variety, but I think we'll be pretty confident we will give this the sort of grades that are consistent with where pupils would have got, probably a little bit overall, not individually, but overall, will be slightly higher because our mechanisms take out those bad days. If I just move on to the question of the predicted grades, the predicted grades are not a rigorously calculated estimation. That's because we don't have the data on which to rigorously calculate them at this point. What we do have is the teacher's judgment about where pupils are likely to be, given that they've been teaching them for 2 years. They have had things like the trials, which gives them an indication, but it is certainly not the final indication. They had some tests last year that had the term of teaching beforehand. But remember, what we're trying to do is predict. We're not trying to say, this is how well you've done in the previous 18 months. So there is a significant element of professional judgment. What we do know is that our estimations overall are very accurate in terms of what we've done in the past. When in the past we've had predictions straight after trials, or we've had predictions later on in the year. As a cohort, they have been statistically the same. There has been some variation, and within the case of individuals, there is obviously some variation there. But I think what we're confident on is we can give a very good estimation of where pupils are likely to be at this point. But it isn't a mechanical algorithm or process of working out. Because even in a good year, how someone does in trials, let's say in January, does not give you a direct correlation with how they will do at the end. That said, our professional judgment tends to get it right the later we get in the process, and we are now quite late in the process.
Thank you.
Thanks, John. And some of these things, they generate sort of more questions and things, and especially if some of them are related perhaps to I'm not saying John's was, but if you think about things, you think, gosh, I'm thinking about my own particular child, then please do contact in either Duncan directly or through the house system as well, because I'm very conscious that this evening we'll be trying to give sort of some fairly broad generic responses to some of the questions. So we've just got 3 more questions lined up on the chat side at the moment, 4 by the looks of it. So the first one is a question, and a good question about how are you factoring in the children's mental health within their predicted grades? What if it's really a case of a child underperforming due to a bad month rather than simply a bad day? So
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and I think it's something we try and look at as holistically as possible. And yes, a bad month isn't going to be the determinant of it, because if you think of what have we seen of the pupils, we've only seen them in the flesh just in the last 2 days. I think we're only likely to get that largely wrong if someone's had a bad 6 months or a bad 12 months. I think we do know where people are pastorally as well, so we do know that the academic side and the pastoral side are interlinked. So there will be some pupils whose performance has been looks on paper not terribly strong, and yet we are predicting something stronger. Because we know what has been affecting them, possibly not the last month, maybe the last 6 months. So that's where it's a good and a bad thing, this professional judgment. It can sound like a bit of a cop-out to say, well, that's just what I think. But I think what it does do is I think we're good at it, but equally, I think it does take into account those sorts of things.
It's may be helpful just to go back to last year as well, when we had to do the CAGs, the centre assessed grades. And one of the first things we did was, because that actually happened sort of, after the course had been finished, there's pretty much just study leave left and exams to be taken. And so when we were being asked then, it was a very different question, by the way, but we were being asked then to say, what do we think the pupils would have got if they'd gone on to sit the papers? Now, so the context is a bit different, but we went back then to the forecast grades and said, well, actually, we've been asking ourselves the same question here at school for years and years and years. Let's just challenge ourselves. How accurate have we been in those years? And when we looked into that through that lens, we found that we'd actually been within 3 to 5% accurate across all the grades from what we were forecasting earlier in the year to what pupils actually got in the summer as well. So that sense of the professional judgment and its validity, I think, is quite strong. There's a question which I'll pick up and then pass another one to Duncan. So what will happen if any pupils are isolating during an assessment week? Well, we obviously don't want to see pupils disadvantaged in that way. I think it would depend upon two things. If they were to have asymptomatic, so they've got a positive test, or somebody else has, and that's why they're isolating, but they're not themselves unwell, then we would be looking for opportunities for them to take their assessments under online supervision. Now, when we were doing that back in January, it was obviously very difficult to do that completely precisely for the large entry subjects. So I think the way we'd be looking at that would be to give them the opportunities to sit those assessments at home so they don't fall out and fall behind on that one, but making sure that the way cameras are positioned and so forth, that we can sort of hand on heart say to ourselves and the exam board, we're confident with what they got. If, however, somebody very sadly is unwell, then I think what we'd be doing is we'd be putting in place something similar to the way that you have special consideration that goes to the exam boards when a child is unwell or has particular pastoral, significant pastoral issues that come through. Now, previously, we've sort of been making the case to the exam board where we think, where we think the issues lie. Here, we'll be sort of making the case to ourselves as much as anything else and being able to justify it to the exam board. So finding ways in which we can sort of mitigate. So again, we wouldn't want that to disadvantage any of our pupils either. I'm going to pass this next one to Duncan. So this is, I think everyone can see this one, but it's the one that says, will it not be useful for the students to get the results from their weekly tests so they can see where the weaknesses are and refine their revision?
Yeah. In one sense, it would be. However, I think there's an issue of timing, and there is an issue of the way we've tried to compartmentalise. I think the vast majority of subjects have four lessons a week, 4 40-minute lessons, and to go through and feed back on an hour assessment would take 2 lessons. It would be a typical sort of amount of time to do that. What we've tried to do is say, okay, in many subjects, or the majority of subjects, when you've done this assessment, the preparation for the next assessment is if you like, a fresh start. We're trying not to overlap content from one to the other. It's a thing which we move backwards and forwards between, and what we feel is the best thing is for people to be looking forward to preparing for the next one rather than spending a lot of time looking at the past one. Yes, you could learn some things from it, but we feel that the balance is more in moving forward. The other one is actually the time it takes because if a teacher's got 20, 30, 40 people, teaches 2 sets, as many of them do in this year group, to mark those to get them then moderated and get something back to the pupils which is accurate, I think the time is very much against us on that. So it's a sense of moving forward and saying, okay, yes, you've done this, now let's prepare for the next one, rather than spending time going over it.
And there will also be opportunities in the lessons, so we're looking towards the next assessment. So if there are things like, so for example, in my old subject of RS, if pupils were not getting the correct balance in of making sure they justified 2 different perspectives and then come to a reasoned conclusion, and a teacher's starting to spot sort of trends and patterns happening, there'll be opportunities to look at it from a skills basis as much as a content basis. I'll take the next one, then pass the next one to Duncan. So it's please can you explain how the benchmarking against other schools can work? So Emma, first of all, I'm going to apologise if I've misinterpreted the question, and please do come back in on the chat if that's the case. We won't ourselves be benchmarking ourselves against other schools. We'll be looking at our pupils and our professional judgment. What we've done is we've looked at other schools and their approaches and worked quite professionally and collaboratively with them to just sort of health check how we're going about our thinking. They've been doing the same with us to refine it. If it's to do with sort of national benchmarking, so the awarding of grades across the entire country, that there's not actually a great deal of detail in any of the publications that we've seen about that one. Ordinarily, what would happen is all the marks goes into the hopper of a particular exam board. They go through and they look at how the marks come out. They look at the usual grade boundaries, then they compare the outcomes and they see how things are going. And then there's a sort of a cross exam board process that does that as well, to check that the different exam boards are operating within the same sort of tolerance bands and things. That simply isn't going to be possible this year, because rather than there being sort of 3 or 4 exam boards in total, there are however many schools there are in the country. So the government on Ofqual are conspicuously silent upon that. I think what they're fundamentally saying is that they're leaving it to schools to use all of their best professional judgment and to be in a position to justify the grades they've given if challenged and if asked to do so.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. Emma, look, as I say, I sort of interpreted your question in a couple of ways. It may well be there was a 3rd way or a 4th way that I didn't spot, so I hope that was helpful. And then there's a question to pass to Duncan, which is, how will you take into account the fact that some pupils will have really struggled with both the online trials and online learning and may have had a bad term for this reason?
Yeah, I think this goes to the heart of why we're trying to use professional judgment alongside our, what raw data we have, because the circumstances are really quite difficult for everyone, and they will have affected people in different ways. I think what we hope is that with these 3 weeks of teaching and the face-to-face work next term, what we will be able to do is, those pupils who've found the online thing difficult, they should sort of come through things more strongly then. Again, I can also see that an argument might be made that, okay, they're a bit behind at this point. That is one of the difficulties we face. But equally, I think we one of the things we are doing is taking out content to prepare, which needs to be prepared. So hopefully that makes things a little bit easier. In the end, what we do have to use is help pupils to do their best, to use our professional judgment. And this is also why we're not looking at the trials as an important way of determining what their final grades are, nor at what's happening now. We're trying to say, okay, where have you got to, and give them as many chances to get to that place as we can over the next few months. It is a challenge, but I think we're very aware of exactly what you're talking about there. But ultimately, the question we've been asked to provide a grade for is, what have the pupils achieved, rather than what might they have achieved if things were different. And it's a subtle difference there, and I think hopefully our system can mitigate against the person who may feel they're relatively behind others.
Okay. Well, there's no more questions on the chat function at the moment, so I hope that that's been helpful for you all. And as I said earlier on, we're obviously, I mean, you know, the core intention is to recognise that the boys and girls have had a very unusual sort of 2-year process going through, and to make sure that at the end analysis they don't get disadvantaged by the process. And that's one of the things that's at the heart of that. And then alongside being able to justify the professional judgment that we'll be making, I do hope it's been helpful. As I mentioned earlier on, if you've got particular questions or indeed further questions, things that pop up into your minds after this evening has finished, please do get in touch directly. We've got, so for those of you who are fortunate enough to have children in both the upper sixth and the fifth form, and I can see a couple of on screen, we'll be back on at 7 o'clock to do a very sort of similar process for the A levels. So thank you very much indeed, everybody. Thank you for coming on this evening. I do hope it's been useful, and as ever, just please just stay in touch. Thank you very much indeed.